It's live. Hi, Willard Dawson, aka Billy Ghote. Glad to be here. It's my first presentation at a conference, so a little bit of nervous, a little bit of that, but not too much. Okay, so the presentation today is about Lotus Notes password hashes, and those that are today exposed to the internet with basically no protections, and my activities around that. Who am I? I'm an information security architect at New York Life Insurance Company. I've been in that position for a year and a half. Before that, I worked as a penetration tester for SunGuard availability services and a variety of jobs before that. So I've been basically living in Atlanta for the past 20 years. Some odd years. So, well, that's about me. So what this is about, Lotus Notes. We're going to talk a little bit about what Notes is and what it actually does for you. It's more than just email, but it has a rich history. We're going to talk about some of that history and talk about the background behind some of the vulnerabilities that have been announced and discovered over the years and some previous presentations. I'm going to go over some tools that are available for testing Lotus Notes, and there are quite a few tools. And I'm going to give some samples of what I was able to find during my testing and some observations about what I discovered after doing some password cracking and other testing. Lotus Domino. It's so easy to say Lotus Notes all the time. I keep finding myself doing that. Lotus Notes is actually the client-side application that goes against Lotus Domino servers. So there are some special protections that are enabled for client access to Notes servers, and I'm really not going to dig into that too much. But so there are some mitigating factors to the passwords being exposed. So if for example, Lotus iNotes, which is we'll get into in a moment, isn't available, then you may not be able to leverage the password, the user authentication components that you've cracked to actually access email. But email is not the only target. Right, so messaging and calendaring, the most common use of Notes. There are also quick web page development software available with Lotus Domino, and that is kind of if you wanted to draw a parallel to the Microsoft world, it's probably most like SharePoint. So there are easy web page development tools that are part of this, and it's called Quicker. So there's also iNotes, which is a web-based capability, and some other things. We'll see do the rundown on another slide in a moment. It has support for multiple operating systems. It runs on Windows, runs on various flavors of Unix, and supports server clustering, which comes into play later. So I mentioned Quicker. There's also a product called SameTime, which is a meeting planning and coordination tool. SameTime has some interesting aspects to it if you're penetration testing, that sometimes you find meetings advertised locally, openly with no passwords, and you can sometimes invite yourselves to meetings and participate in their meetings. Without having been invited, of course, officially. So, and of course, then you can also see who's attending the meetings, because generally that's also not obscured, and you can use that for social engineering attacks. So that's pretty nice to know. iNotes is the webmail component for Lotus Domino, and pretty much just like OWA for Microsoft in that regard. Lotus Notes Traveler is a product that allows you to get your Lotus Notes email on your iPhone, and it has basically a basic authentication component, which of course you could brute force. And generally speaking, I don't see a lot of companies deploying certificate-based authentication for Traveler, although for the actual thick client for Notes, you sometimes find that certificate-based authentication. And that is, we'll talk about that some more when we get to mitigations. Who actually uses Lotus Domino? Well, that's kind of varied over the years, but as recently as 2006 and 2010 timeframe, probably somewhere around 40% of the corporate world is using Lotus Notes in terms of the actual number of mailboxes that are deployed. So a lot of large enterprises and big companies, extremely large companies, are using it. And these bullets were lifted from the documents that are mentioned here, so not my own research. There's also, you can find a list of companies, so you want to get down to specifics about companies who are actually using it. In fact, the company I work for uses it. The previous company I worked for uses it. And I have to say, I'm not a happy user. I don't like Lotus Notes. So here I am to bash it, right? Yeah, me neither, to be honest. And we're actively looking to migrate away from it. But the challenge you get into as a large corporation is that you develop applications and databases on it. So it takes some planning and coordination to migrate away from it. And it's a non-trivial task in a lot of companies because there really are major migration headaches around it. So next we'll talk about some background, history and previous work, a couple of previous research papers that are worth looking at from 2001, DEF CON presentation. Was really good material. And also Hacking Domino, which was a presentation, or actually some papers that came out of some company in Russia. Has some very good background, as a matter of fact, on how to extend access into Lotus Domino servers, to gain admin access to the servers, to leverage that access using NCAT, for example, or other tools, and of course pivot and extend your presence into the company's networks. Doing fast pen tests, I managed to do some things of that nature. So I don't want to go into those kind of specifics because this really isn't about pen testing per se, but just to know once you get access to Lotus Domino password hashes and crack those, if you gain access to admin hashes, now you're talking about gold as far as penetration goes. So there is history of weakness, and we'll talk about that. A couple of CVEs that are worth noting. In fact, I'm also giving this talk at SkyTalks. And so my title there was 2005 wants their hashes. So as long ago as 2005, we knew about the specific vulnerabilities that I'm talking about here. And yet, corporations are not configuring their servers to defend against it because they either don't know about it, maybe their staff has changed, and the folks who did know about it aren't there anymore. But however you explain it, the guard's asleep at the gate. Oh, and the link at the bottom is a good site to look at because you get it brings into view additional CVEs that may be of interest. So it's more than just looking at the specific CVE. So I found that to be a useful link. Some tools. I'm not sure how I'm doing on time, so I don't want to rush through it. I'm good. All right, so a few links. There's some really good articles, especially I found on Search Domino, about securing Lotus. And I should mention, if you want the presentation, I'll be happy to share it. Yeah. So it's not trying to hide it or stay in hiding too awful bad. But so there are. I found these to be useful tutorials about securing Lotus Notes, and also discussing some of the password's still a threat on Lotus domains. Not the first presentation that's been made about the problem at hand. And of course, if you want those links, it's much easier to get it from the presentation. But these are the tools that I found for testing Lotus Domino. The one that I would say is probably, to me, the most helpful. Domino Hashbreaker does more than just test for password hashes, but it also tests for other weaknesses. So that's a really useful tool. And so the Raptor Domino hash link at the top is probably the best one for actually extracting hashes from servers. The problem that I have with that tool is that it basically pulls one field from the user directory and the hashes. And what I found it to be useful to get all of the fields and to scrape the web pages so that I had all that content at my disposal. And so rather than rely on that tool, I did some scripting of my own that I'll show you momentarily. The thing about their tool, though, it leverages additional weaknesses besides just unpassword user directories that aren't password protected. So it has some capabilities that the scripts I wrote don't have, and that tool can be very useful when simple password evasion is not an option. So how do you find these Domino servers? They're scattered all over, and mainly what I'm talking about today is web access to Domino servers. So there's three ways that I went about that. There's actually some known Google queries that are talked about in Google Dorks, and so we'll show you a couple examples there. ERIP is the Every Routable Internet IP project, and that has some interesting results when you query that. And of course, I guess you probably all know about Shodan. There's nothing new about that. I will say in a moment, Google Dorks, a link to where you can find probably the first Google Dorks that were published, but you really don't find many hits from that. So as you start looking at this and searching with Google, I use Tor a lot, and Google doesn't like Tor very much. So yeah, it makes life interesting when you're trying to get around that. But anyways, still managed to do so. And I found, especially if we scroll down the page a bit, when you iterate for U.S. states and U.S. territories and global top-level domains, that Google really doesn't block you that much, especially on Tor. So just the nature of the query that you make, they home in on certain types of queries. So breaking it up in that fashion, they really just left me alone for the most part. So just one quick, it's kind of not very visible, but one quick result, querying for Alabama. And in this case, I found it better to break down the U.S. domain into the individual states. I wanted to limit the results that I got. And at this time, I was really just doing things manually, just to see what I would find. I started this off in September of last year, just playing around. And actually, you know, I really didn't mention, I forgot to mention it, why I started this little project. That would have been good to know, right? Well, I hate using nodes. And really, during my pen testing career, I was a very avid user of John the Ripper, and password cracking. So 2 years ago, the first Crack Me If You Can contest that CoreLogic organized, I participated in that and had a lot of fun doing that. This system right here is my cracking engine. So unlike the competitors there who actually won the competition with GPU-enabled computers and spiffy software like Hashcat, I didn't have any of that. So I thought it was very respectable that I did not come in dead last. You know, for me that was my goal. Don't come in last, and actually managed to crack around. I forget the actual number, but a very decent number, around 35 or 50,000. I forget, somewhere in there. A drop in the bucket compared to the 500 million that they managed to crack. Really, that's cool and everything, but the bad news is Hashcat and the GPU-enabled tools do nothing for Lotus Notes hashes, and I think it's an awareness issue. I mean, certainly they developed the software to go after the hash formats that people know about, like MD5 or SHA-1, because those get all the press release. You know, you get LinkedIn with SHA-1, big news, right? Lotus Notes, nobody cares, right? Hopefully we'll make them care. So some additional Google queries that got some different results, and especially like this quicker one. So I'm actually looking for, with some experience, okay, some experience in looking at these sites, I start to see hostname conventions that companies are using, and they're quite open about what kind of server they have embedded in the domain name. It's really quite helpful to us pen testers. Thank you very much. So, all right, some samples. It's kind of hard to see, not too bad though. So here's a search. I did a Google lookup, and I tried to redact the actual identifying information. So I actually haven't disclosed these vulnerabilities to the companies that are affected, and yet plan to do so as time permits. But when you talk about the results and the number of sites that I'm finding, it's going to be a large task to let them all know. To be honest, it's more than I can do a couple hours a day, and actually say I've accomplished it. Somebody needs that as a full-time job. I nominate IBM. reach out to your customers and help them secure their environments. So I clicked the link, and this is what I found. And I keep looking because I want to make sure I actually redacted the host name and all that. I think I did. So this is a quicker site. It actually has some publicly accessible content with obviously no authentication, but in this case, no sites. But if you add names.nsf, now you're looking at the user directory, the published user web directory for this server. And it has identifying information, which I've attempted to cover up. Now there's a special view for that you can leverage in Lotus Domino. Well, let's take another look, drill down actually into the menu options. But the important thing here to note is that you can look at the all server documents list, and it will tell you every server that makes up the cluster. In this case, it's a single server. But oftentimes you find more detail about every server in their Lotus domain. We found this one's actually a Windows server, so I guess if we were going to pivot, that would be a nice place to pivot, because then we could use something like Metasploit and jump all over it. Anyway, with the users view, the $users and the parentheses around that, you get a little bit more information. And I don't show you all the columns that are available here, but just the name and the list name. But as you scroll further to the right, there are many more other data points, and there's one called HTTP password. The HTTP password column has a hashed content. It's the hashed password for the user, and that's what we're after. That is exactly what we're after. Sometimes you will find that companies have obscured that information, but if they haven't bothered to protect the directory, generally they haven't. I found one or two sites that actually obscured their and we'll talk about it in the mitigation section, but one or two places that had the directory open but actually allowed that hid the hash. But for the most part, if the directory is open, they've also not protected against the hash. And there are other ways to approach the problem too, to limit access. So this is another site, just as one more example. This actually is what you see when you go to the website itself. Yes, they want you to authenticate, but the directory is open. So if you simply check for names.nsf like the Google Docs query and saw the password prompt and assumed that you couldn't get access to it, well, you passed up an opportunity. So this is kind of the same layout we saw before, but an example of, well, that's user data. Sorry, more user data. Interesting to see things like BlackBerry administrator in the full name listing. So we get some appreciation about the other technologies they've deployed. And probably if we crack that password, we might have useful information on other systems. And here's the example of a clustered environment. So you can see more server detail that you could use. So from all my Google searches, I found 93 unique sites, excluding all the clusters. So taking out the cluster servers and just unique sets of password hashes I was able to pull out. But because I'm doing it manually, because the API went away, because Bing didn't like their API as much, even though it was freely available at the time. Look, there's something else we can do. So let's look at ERIP, Every Routable IP project. It's a project that basically attempts to do Google one better. Instead of following web spidering, it simply attempts to enumerate through IP addresses. Doesn't seem like it's been updated in a while, because every time I check it, I get the same results for this particular query. But like Shodan, you can query specific search items and get different results back. And at the time I tested, none of these sites were exposing their directory, so I didn't feel the need to block their information. But you can see basically the information they were able to pull and which version info and domain names. It's very, very helpful. So I wrote a script to enumerate it, and I'm lazy. So I started off my career as a software designer, doing C and C++ and a lot of heavy database lifting. But these days I mainly throw things together in Bash with awk and maybe a little Perl if I have to. I thought, maybe I will turn this into a Metasploit module. Yeah, no, that's too much work. I didn't get around to it yet. I think it would be cool though to add it to the framework. So here's the thing running. Basically just a bunch of wgets, and then I parse through the output, and I've obscured the IPs because those actually are vulnerable potentially, and actually those happen to be. So simply by scraping the results from ERIP, and then pulling the IP information out, I've created a list of IPs that I still need to process, and I'll show you what I do with that later. So those are just lists of Lotus Domino servers. At that point in time, I still really didn't know whether the server is exposing its hashes or not. Just a raw list of things to go test. So you'll get tons and tons of servers, because how many? Well, lots of servers to go take a look at. Did I say how many? Yeah, 4,509 servers that ERIP told me about that are Lotus Domino servers. So just from that one query. So I did a handful of other queries, and unfortunately I didn't really track the results to know which one gave me. I just threw it all into a big pile. But one thing I did test, for example, IBM gets you lots of Apache servers. And really, the Apache servers are, generally speaking, not Domino servers, so that's kind of a wasted effort. And but I went through the effort anyway to test each and every one of them to see if they happen to have Domino hiding. Hugely time-consuming. So here's my little bash for loop to actually run through and enumerate the tests against each one of them. So I'll do a wget against each IP on ports 80, 443, and 8080, and drop that into a test file. And then I'm going to actually just use grep against the output HTML to see if it contains the word HTTP password. So if it does, they're vulnerable. That's simple. And that gave me 314 vulnerable Lotus Domino servers from ERIP out of those thousands, which I thought was a pretty good result. Shodan, I think probably anyone not know Shodan? All right. Shodan is cool. You can search things like Lotus Domino as a string, in this case hyphenated, and a total result of 77,155 servers to test. I'm still testing those. I didn't get done. Because I said to myself, I don't want to pay for a Shodan. I just want to use free stuff. And so okay, it's only $19 for the anniversary deal. Why not? So about a month ago, I started using the API for that and pulling results down. And I'm awful with names. I should have written it down, but the gentleman who actually put it together, I reached out to him for some advice and some support, and he found out I was doing it for a research project, and he just gave me all the results. He said, here they are. So, totally nice guy. And I'm super ashamed I can't remember his name. Early onset, really. Truthfully. So, 71,000 results. Now, these are just raw Domino servers that at one point in time were exposed to the internet. And, of course, they may or may not be up now. So, what do I do with that? Well, I've shown you basically how I scrape those web pages. Now I want to gather those hashes together. And this is where the Raptor Domino hash program does its magic. But I wanted something a little bit different. And then I'm going to crack those hashes. So this is me scraping the individual servers. It's very simple. It's actually a couple of pages, so it's longer than this, but 3 pages. So I didn't actually provide the text for this, so if anybody is interested in using it, reach out to me and I'll be happy to give you the actual scripts. You don't have to type them in, but pretty straightforward. You just enumerate through all the pages. Now there can be some trickiness around that, because we looked, and I guess, sorry if I have to bounce back, so I really won't do it, but depending on the version of Domino, the presented directory has different arrow buttons. And some of those, if you click them, you can click directly to the end page, and then an additional page, and it tells you actually the numeric URL parameter that takes you directly to the end. Generally speaking, these pages are broken up into blocks of 29 by default. If you just keep clicking the next arrow as you're manually viewing the web page, you get them in blocks of 29 line items on within the directory. So I can preset how I enumerate through that by just brute forcing my way page at a time if I know when to stop. So that's handy. But in older versions of Lotus Domino, you really don't have that information at your disposal. So I actually parsed out the JavaScript and calculate from that where it's taking me from one page to the next. And that's handy because sometimes the pages don't follow numeric boundaries. They have funny little period dividers. So they're not really just numeric parameters. They're alphanumeric parameters. And then there are the occasional pages that I couldn't do any of that with, so I have a manual script where I simply brute force and watch it by eye until I think it's done and then kill it, which I haven't included here. And when all else fails, go back to Raptor Domino hash because it really works just about every time. So a few pages of that. All right, so once I've actually gathered all these HTML pages, I put together another script to extract out from it the fields that I'm interested in. And the reason I want to I'm building an output file that I'm going to feed to John the Ripper. So I want there to be two columns separated by a colon, which is the default separator in John the Ripper. And the left column, it can be anything. But what I found when you're using single mode in John the Ripper is that if you build out your input data with as much information possible, you actually wind up with a lot better results when you're cracking. So that's another reason for not using Raptor Domino hashes, because when you actually feed that to John the Ripper, you don't wind up cracking as many quite so quickly. Of course, you can let it run in incremental mode and brute force it, but that's going to be very time consuming. So that's my motivation for this little script. And I also match on the, because for some strange reason, username, the email address version of the username can appear at various locations within the output file. So it's kind of hard to predict which column is going to contain the email address. And so I basically did some character matching on that. I won't actually show an example of the hash table output that I did because that is very revealing. It's massively revealing. We won't go there. And the hash formats. There are basically two well-known hash formats within Lotus Domino. One is the unsalted, which goes back many, many years, but you still find it pervasive in use. And salted is the so-called more secure password hash format type, and John the Ripper calls these Lotus 5 and Domino Sec. And I used some guidance from Rick Redmond's paper on the topic about different ways of doing pattern matching, and it's very useful. But these examples here don't really take any of that into account, and you get quite a lot of results using just this simple type of thing. As you might imagine, running on my i5 laptop, it's a slow process. It's not very speedy. Word lists are definitely the way to go. RockU matches very often. Pure Hate's word list is a very good one. Got Milk and the Inside Pro dictionaries are very good. And there's a pretty good listing at Skull Security as well. And I use these often. Oh, is it? It's very, very helpful. So, what did I do? So far, and it's a snapshot in time because things are still moving. Approaching 12 million gathered hashes, unique, lines of input, I should say. And the lines of input, for me, means multiple lines that, because of the way I'm assembling that hash input file. In terms of just the account data, here's where I'm actually saying these are the unique email addresses that I've identified. And unique hashes, this takes into account also that Lotus 5 format is unsalted, so the same password has the same hash every time. So with the salted hashes, of course, because it is salted, the same password may generate a different salted hash, and it's hard to predict exactly how many unique passwords will come out of it once it's cracked. But so far, you can see basically what I managed to do. Performance issues, especially with the more secure format. On this machine, when I load my input file, takes probably 72 or 80 hours just to start cracking, because it takes, the way John works is it loads the entire thing into memory first, and with the domino the domino sec form, that's very time consuming. Even when I'm running from my SSD, so it's not running from an SSD is definitely the right way to go, because it does speed load time, but very problematic. The old format, the Lotus 5 format, John is smart enough to spread that across multiple or hyper-threaded CPU instances. So there's actually, I'm consuming 400% of my CPU on the laptop with that format. But the domino sec form, it's very serial in nature, so it can only do one of those. It's not hyper-threaded, so it's not parallel at all. So I don't know if there's a good opportunity to parallelize it for GPU, but I'm hopeful that there is, and at some point in the future we may have better tools. So just a quick rundown of some of the findings. It's unique accounts, it's very large organizations, which I won't mention by name because that's kind of too revealing, but a large automobile manufacturer, a few banks, computer manufacturer in China that you probably know. Very decent results. I also found, and I didn't really make a slide to address it, but because these quicker pages and other tools are being used for open sites, there's also a frequent use of Lotus Domino to support self-registration websites. So a lot of times what you find are email addresses that are things that people have entered. They're not an employee of the company, but the site's being managed for a community at large. And there was at least one organization in Florida that I found that had an enormous number of actual users. And then another organization in Texas that was aimed at teachers that has an enormous number of passwords. And then I found a Caribbean bank that has a large number of users. And oddly enough, they're all mostly in the financial industry in the U.S. So imagine what you could do with that. Some mitigations. You've got different settings that are specific to blocking access to information. And these first two basically cover that. So you can obscure the fields. You can limit anonymous access to the directory. So the challenge with that is that if you don't hide the password fields and you do allow it, or you don't, and if you allow the password fields to remain, but you disable anonymous access, all you've done is hidden the fields from inside users. So if you're an authenticated user, you could still get access to those hashes if that's the case. You can actually extend my script. If you want to use something like burp and capture your authentication headers and stick those into the script, you can actually use that to capture hashes as an authenticated user. Not that I would recommend that sort of thing, but it could be done, and you might find some very interesting details. And of course, if and only if the password fields are still exposed and the hashes even to authenticated users. The last recommendation I found on military sites in the U.S. that the common access card, as they call it, or two-factor authentication, is frequently in use. This is a pretty decent article because this is the company that actually helped them do that, and they speak to what they did to make that happen. So they address some special things that had to be done on same-time servers that don't support authenticated certificate-based authentication. And as we approach the end of the presentation, is it forgotten? Yeah, kind of, sort of. Is it dead? Not really. It's still out there. And they're freely sharing that with us, just waiting for us to test it. So my last slide, I'm begging someone to step up and take action. IBM, please help your customers secure their networks. And owner-operators, go to these documents. I didn't present a link for it, but there are some very good Red Book articles on securing Lotus Domino. IBM, generally speaking, has some very good documentation. I think the weaknesses here are that IT organizations are not following through on those documents and proactively building architecture to take advantage of those to harden their servers, and they need to step it up. So that's, yep. Well, some of the approaches that you can use to move away from actual username password authentication, I think I haven't evaluated that one specifically, but in my own company we're making the same moves. And we obscure ours using some other protective technologies, and I started to, but I didn't provide snapshots here. But some companies are protecting their infrastructure altogether by blocking it from the internet and setting up another user authentication layer using things like UAG or other secure reverse proxies to limit access. And I think those are all very good moves. Oh, sure. I'll take it back to the beginning. I'm probably blowing up the video camera. Yep. And I have cards if anybody wants, but that's my corporate information. I should have printed personal cards, but didn't. So that's it.